My name is Evelyn Hart, and I was still smoothing the crease on my black dress when the lawyer read my sister's will. The room smelled like leather and lemon polish, and my hands wouldn't stop worrying the edge of a tissue I hadn't used. Clara Whitmore. My sharp, quiet sister was gone, and the words she leaves everything to Evelyn floated in the air like dust motes I couldn't breathe around. A soft knock, then the door opened. Andrew walked in. First expensive shoes, easy smile. Melissa followed with a bakery bag she held like a peace offering. Daniel hovered behind them, eyes dipping to the carpet, until he remembered to lift them. Mom Melissa said like it hadn't been 18 years since she last used the word. I felt heat rise under my collar, that mix of surprise and an old stubborn ache that had learned not to cry where anyone could see it. They sat without asking. Andrew leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and told me he was sorry for my loss. His tone had the polish of a presentation, not a prayer. I looked at their faces and waited for something real to show some crack where love might leak through. Nothing did. Clara once told me, "When people arrive all at once, they've been on their way for a long time." I folded the tissue and held her sentence like a handle. My children had come back. I already knew why. The service had ended only a day earlier, but the scent of lilies still clung to my coat when I stepped into Harold Benson's office. Clara had trusted him for decades, and now it was his voice that carried her last intentions into the world. I sat stiff in the high-backed chair, the kind that made you feel smaller no matter how straight you tried to hold your spine. My palms pressed against the fabric of my skirt to keep them from trembling. I thought grief would be the only weight I carried into that room. I was wrong. Harold's tone was dry, measured every word struck like a gavel. He listed properties, accounts, the family house on Meadow Lane, 3 rental buildings, stocks, and bonds that meant nothing to me except numbers on a page. Each line ended with the same phrase to Evelyn Hart. I wanted to stop him to ask if he was certain, but Clara's handwriting on those documents left no doubt. She had planned this down to the commas and margins. Still, when the folder snapped shut, I felt the air leave my lungs as though I'd been holding it since her first sentence. And then the door opened. The sound of polished shoes against the wood floor carried more power than Harold's entire recital. Andrew filled the doorway with his broad frame and practiced expression. His hairline had thinned, but his confidence hadn't. Melissa slipped in right behind her lips, painted in a color too bright for morning, clutching a paper bag that smelled of croissants. Daniel lingered in the back as he always had the shadow of a son who never quite stepped forward. I didn't rise. My fingers curled around the armrest, holding myself steady, while time bent around their presence. Melissa's voice broke the silence first. "Mom," she said, soft, almost tender. The word pricked my chest like a thorn. I had dreamt of hearing it for years, but not like this. Not in this room, not with Harold staring at us like he'd stumbled into a scene he wished he could excuse himself from. Andrew extended his hand, a politician's move, confident and hollow. I kept mine in my lap. His smile twitched for a second, then returned with more polish. He murmured something about regrets, about missing me, about wanting to help. Melissa pushed the bag forward, croissants rustling. "We thought you might not be eating enough," she said. Daniel kept quiet eyes sliding away whenever mine tried to catch his. Harold cleared his throat, reminding us of the solemnity of the space, but their voices filled it anyway, smooth words layered over 18 years of silence. I listened, not because I believed them, but because Clara's warning still echoed in my memory. Sudden arrivals are never sudden. My children had rehearsed this, and though my grief was raw, I recognized performance when it sat across from me, dressed as family. I smoothed the crease in my skirt again. The game had already begun. The night they told me to leave has never faded, no matter how many years pressed themselves between then and now. Andrew stood in the center of the living room, his arms crossed like a judge, telling me I hovered too much, that I drained the energy of the house. Melissa dropped a folded blanket at my feet as though she were doing me a favor. Daniel wouldn't even meet my eyes. He stared at the television volume, low face set like stone. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I walked out with a duffel bag, a jacket, and the sound of my children's silence pushing me toward the door. 4 blocks later, I found myself at a gas station, fluorescent lights buzzing above rows of gum and stale coffee. I dialed Clara. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't ask if I was all right. She said only, "Stay where you are. I'm coming." 20 minutes later, her black sedan rattled up beside the curb headlights, flashing against my tears. She unlocked the passenger door from the inside, slid a paper cup of tea into my hands, and drove me back to her house without a single question. That was Clara, quiet, unsentimental, but steady as oak. That first night, I slept in her guest room beneath a quilt she had folded herself. The next morning, fresh eggs sat on the counter, a jar of strawberry jam I hadn't mentioned in years, waiting beside the bread. She stocked the fridge with whole milk and plain yogurt because she remembered those were mine. She didn't call it kindness. She didn't call it anything. But for the first time in months, I ate breakfast without shame lodged in my throat. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The house filled with a rhythm that didn't require explanation. I watered the plants, sorted her files, left notes on the fridge beside the ones she scribbled in her careful script. She signed them with a single letter B. At first, I tried to talk too much to fill the silences with chatter, but eventually I learned quiet could be a kindness of its own. 1 year passed, then another. She moved me from the guest room into the west bedroom, handed me a key, and never once hinted at when I might leave. We never used the word family, not out loud. Yet in every morning walk, every grocery list, every shared glance, when the news anchor stumbled over his lines, I felt its presence. What I had lost with my children, I found in a different form, sturdier, built on staying rather than abandoning. Clara never said she loved me, but one evening, with her glass of red wine trembling in the sunlight, she said, "Everyone else left. You stayed." She said it as fact, not praise. That was enough. Now, sitting in Harold's office with my children smiling as if they hadn't locked me out of their lives, Clara's words returned like a blade. You stayed. They hadn't. And no apology baked into a pastry bag could rewrite that truth. After the will reading, I tried to convince myself the knock on my door would be a neighbor with condolences or Harold with more papers. But it was Andrew standing on the porch in a pressed jacket with his sleeves rolled, just so as though he had stepped straight from a meeting. His smile looked warm until you studied it too long. Melissa appeared beside him, her arms wrapped around a bouquet of tulips that drooped at the edges, their yellow petals already tired. Daniel stood half a step behind, shifting his weight, his hands buried deep in his pockets. Mom Melissa said again, her voice gentler than it had been at Harold's office, "We just wanted to check on you." She held the tulips out like they might erase 18 years. I didn't step aside, not at first. Their eyes roamed past me into the hallway, searching for signs of a life they hadn't been part of. Finally, I opened the door wider, just enough for courtesy, not invitation. They perched on the couch like visitors in a waiting room, too polite, too stiff. I took Clara's old chair across from them, its blue upholstery still carrying the faint scent of sandalwood. Andrew cleared his throat, folding his hands together. We were thinking. Maybe we could help you manage things. An estate this size can be complicated. People might try to take advantage of you. His tone carried concern, but his gaze slid toward the stack of envelopes on my desk. Melissa nodded quickly, her smile rehearsed. Clara was our aunt too. She wouldn't want all this to divide us. Family should come together. Daniel finally spoke, his voice low. It's been a long time. We made mistakes, but maybe we can fix some of it now. I looked at each of them, my chest tight with a mixture of longing and suspicion. There had been nights I dreamt of hearing those words. Birthdays, I imagined their calls. Holidays, I pretended I'd see their faces at my door, and here they were saying all the right things in all the wrong ways. I asked Andrew what book I had last read before Clara died. His mouth opened closed. Silence. I asked Melissa what meal she thought I craved most on winter nights. She guessed pot roast. I almost laughed. It had always been lentil soup. I turned to Daniel, asking him to look me in the eye. He tried, but his gaze fell to his shoes. The silence in the room grew heavier than any accusation. I leaned back, my hands folded calmly. Why now, I asked, my voice even. No one answered. They used polite words until the clock struck the hour, then stood promising to call again soon. As the door shut behind them, the air thickened with the scent of wilted tulips. I knew then it wasn't reunion they wanted. It was recovery of what they believed still belonged to them. And the storm was only beginning. The storm gathered slowly like clouds thickening behind the hills before anyone thought to carry an umbrella. At first it was subtle, a voicemail from Andrew reminding me he could introduce me to a financial advisor, Melissa, dropping by with a box of pastries and questions about whether I'd spoken to Harold again. Daniel leaving short notes at the door in handwriting that felt more like obligation than affection. I let them talk. I let them hover. But Clara's voice pressed against my thoughts. Sudden arrivals are never sudden. One evening, while sorting through the folder Harold had given me, I found an envelope sealed in Clara's neat script. She had left it specifically for me to open if they come back. My hands shook as I broke the seal. Inside, Clara had written what I already feared. People who abandon their mother rarely return for love. Regret grows loud when wealth is involved. Do not mistake tears for truth unless their actions prove otherwise. She detailed the legal protections she had set in place, clauses, transfers, signatures that left no room for dispute. But it was her clarity, not the law, that steadied me. She had known this day would come. She had prepared for me to face it alone. The very next week, Harold called. His tone was clipped professional, but I caught the unease beneath it. Andrew's been inquiring, he said, quietly through a local firm. They're probing for possible trust disputes. My grip tightened on the receiver, but my voice stayed calm. Thank you, Harold, I told him. Let them look. There's nothing for them to find. Still unease shadowed the house. I began walking the property at dawn, circling the garden Clara once tended with military precision. The roses had overgrown their petals, curling against the fences, but the sight anchored me. They had bloomed without permission, stubborn and unafraid. I wondered if that was what Clara had wanted me to become. By the end of the month, Andrew arrived again, this time with a stranger in a blazer. He didn't introduce him, only gestured toward the house, as if he were giving a tour of something he already owned. I didn't open the blinds. Instead, I brewed coffee slowly, the way Clara used to, steady, deliberate, unfazed by urgency. When the car finally left, a heaviness remained, an unspoken promise that their campaign had only just begun. That night, I returned to the folder of documents and slid Clara's letter inside. I whispered her words aloud. Do not mistake tears for truth. Then I turned the lock on the cabinet and on the front door. My children thought they were playing a game of persuasion, but they hadn't realized Clara had already chosen the pieces for me. The board was set, and I was no longer a woman who waited to be chosen. The summons came folded in cream paper, crisp and formal, as though politeness could soften the insult. Andrew had filed a petition for a competency evaluation. The words sat heavy in my lap, concern for my mother's ability to manage her estate in her current condition, as though grief had hollowed my mind, as though Clara's careful planning and my own steady hand had turned to ash the moment the ink dried on her will. I pressed the paper flat against the kitchen table and stared out the window at the crooked lemon tree Clara and I had planted years ago. It leaned stubbornly toward the sun, its branches uneven, but it had survived storm after storm. So had I. The courthouse smelled of polished wood and old dust. I wore Clara's wool coat, the one still carrying a faint trace of lilac perfume. My lawyer, Thomas Denning, met me at the steps. He wasn't flashy, but his eyes were sharp, his words trimmed of excess. They have no medical proof, he reminded me. This is a performance, not a case. I nodded, though my stomach tightened all the same. Inside, Andrew sat at the opposite table, immaculate in his gray suit, speaking with a young woman who shuffled papers like weapons. Melissa wore black, her face pinched into something between sympathy and distance. Daniel's gaze stayed on the floor tiles, tracing cracks as though he might escape into them. The judge's gavel struck once, and the performance began. Andrew's lawyer painted me as fragile, isolated, manipulated by grief. She spoke of canceled renovations and new donations as if generosity were evidence of decline. She never said "old woman," but the words hung unspoken in the air. When it was Denning's turn, he rose without fanfare. He spoke of my decades as an administrative coordinator, my meticulous records, the clean balance sheets, the community projects I'd organized in Clara's name. Competence, he told the judge, is not a feeling. It is a standard, and Mrs. Hart meets it with clarity. Then he called a witness. I hadn't expected it. Marlene, the director of the women's shelter Clara had funded, stepped forward. She wore jeans and a blazer, not dressed for spectacle, but for truth. Her voice was calm as she described how I had helped design a new program, showing up week after week, steady as a lighthouse. She is not unraveling, Marlene said. She is leading. The courtroom fell into silence. Andrew shifted in his chair. Melissa looked down. Daniel swallowed hard. The judge called a recess, then returned with a ruling that dismissed the petition entirely. Relief didn't rush me. Instead, a cool stillness settled like standing on firm ground after a tremor. I walked past my children without a word. Their silence trailed me down the courthouse steps. That night, I wrote in Clara's leather notebook, "Today, strangers declared me whole." But I was whole long before they said it. Now I must live it. I thought the courtroom would have ended it, but endings are never so clean. 2 weeks later, an envelope slid through my mail slot with no return address. Inside was a photocopy of a bank statement highlighted in yellow. The account number tugged at something in my memory. Clara had closed that fund years before transferring everything into a trust in my name. Yet here it was, showing a transfer dated 3 years ago, signed not by me, but in handwriting that mimicked mine. My pulse slowed, heavy and deliberate the way it does when anger sharpens into clarity. I called Allison Reed, a financial consultant I had met years ago through Clara's charitable work. She was younger, brisk, the kind of woman who carried a laptop the way others carried a weapon. She came to my kitchen on a Saturday morning, spread files across the table, and traced the threads with a surgeon's precision. Her brows knit as she clicked through documents. Finally, she leaned back, eyes steady. "Your sons opened 3 accounts under aliases," she said. 2 drained already 1, still holding close to $200,000. Forged signatures. Paperwork structured to look legitimate. But it isn't. This didn't start when Clara passed. It started years before. The words landed heavier than the gavel had in court. I had braced myself for their return out of greed, but this was premeditated theft woven into my life long before Clara's death. They hadn't come back because they missed me. They had been preparing for the day they could exploit me long before I knew to guard myself. That night, I sat at Clara's desk, the scent of sandalwood lingering in the drawers, and read her letters again. She had suspected this. She had tried to warn me. Love had blinded me, even in absence. I had imagined remorse. Instead, they had spent their energy plotting. The next morning, I dressed with a calmness that surprised me. I went to Harold's office and signed documents restructuring the estate. I moved every trust into independent fiduciary oversight, severing any loophole Andrew or Daniel thought they might widen. The charitable funds were transferred into the hands of the women I had mentored at the shelter. For the first time, I felt no tremor of guilt, only resolve. When I returned home, I picked up the phone and called Andrew. He answered on the second ring, his voice smooth as always. I gave him one sentence. "From now on, everything goes through legal channels." He stayed silent long enough for me to hear his breath catch. Then I hung up. The house was quiet again. Not empty, not weak. Quiet the way Clara had taught me a quiet that meant boundary. I walked through the garden and touched the crooked lemon tree. It had survived storms by leaning toward its own strength. So would I. The board was reset, and this time the pieces belonged to me. The quiet after my call to Andrew was almost unsettling. No knocks at the door, no flowers on the porch, no voicemails dripping with false regret. For the first time in weeks, I woke without bracing myself for intrusion. Yet silence has a way of holding its breath, and I knew better than to think peace had been handed to me. Peace had to be built. I began by tending the garden Clara once loved. The roses had tangled into wild knots, but I trimmed them back slowly, letting the scent of cut stems fill the air. Each snip of the shears felt like reclaiming space. By the time the sun dipped behind the pines, my hands ached, but my chest felt lighter. Days later, Marlene from the shelter called. "We want to honor Clara." She set a bench in the garden, her name etched in brass. I went to the dedication ceremony, standing among women of every age who had once found refuge there. They spoke about Clara the way I knew her, firm, practical, steady in storms. When the cloth was lifted from the plaque, I traced her name with my fingers. Clara Whitmore, my sister, my anchor, my protector. The women applauded softly, and for the first time since she passed, I felt something close to gratitude instead of grief. When I returned home, a package waited on the steps. Inside was an old photograph of me with Andrew and Daniel at Lake Lania, all of us sunburned and smiling. On the back in Andrew's hand was scrawled, "We weren't always like this." The words pierced deeper than any petition. They were true. There had been love once, laughter, once a family once. I sat with the photo in my lap until the ache dulled into something else. A mourning not just for what they had done, but for what we had lost long before greed took its place. That night, I lit a candle in the window, a tradition Clara and I had started as children to signal someone was coming home. Only this time, it wasn't for them. It was for me. The flame flickered against the glass, small but certain. I whispered to the empty room, "I am home." The following week, I launched the writing program I had been planning with Marlene. We called it Second Voice, a space for women over 60 to write their own stories unedited by those who once silenced them. Watching their pens move across paper felt like watching seeds being planted. Clara had told me once, love isn't something you hoard, it's something you plant. Now I understood. When I walked back through my door that evening, the house no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like sanctuary. My children might still circle from a distance, but the locks were stronger, the boundaries firmer, and my voice no longer waiting for their permission. I had come home to myself, and this time I was free. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy these family drama and revenge stories, please subscribe and join me for more every day.